Fontaine, Archon Quest Act 1 and 2 have concluded with a resounding bang, but that doesn't mean that the show's over, considering we now have a really fascinating plot twist that completely turns Fontaine's justice on its head. And that's the role of Tartaglia. Is he colluding with Arlecchino? Is he a scapegoat? Is he innocent? Or is he truly guilty? We'll just have to find out. But that doesn't mean that we can't theorize, and for that, welcome to Tartaglia the Scapegoat, where I'll be theorizing and speculating what could possibly happen in the future Archon Quest. Disclaimer: this video is not indicative of the final product. These are just based on my personal speculations instead of anything conclusive. So this is less of a concrete theory and more so just me explaining possibilities instead of settling for one. So before we can completely theorize and speculate, we need to set up the groundwork so far of what we know about the verdict. That way, we're on the same page for any lingering context that needs to be reinstated. Firstly, the Oratrice was a subject of interest for Lyonnais and by extension, the Fatui, for reasons currently unconfirmed. But at the moment, we have no conclusive evidence of the Oratrice being directly connected to the Gnosis or the prophecy. But it is safe to theorize that if something was created solely to embody the concept of justice, I'm sure that it has connections to an aspect of fossil lore or just the Hydro Archon in general. Whether it be taking its criteria from divinity or ancient texts or its own conclusions, we don't know. But this is a point of interest for the Fatui. The second is that Tartaglia is currently in Fontaine for business purposes, but is relatively unaware of the customs and the laws of the land. He also was involved in an altercation with a confrere, and this may be in turn the reason of his framing in the original trial for the missing persons cases. However, we don't have the complete details of what is with Tartaglia's current purpose of being in Fontaine, what led to his initial framing, and why his hydro powers are currently acting up. After all, we still have his vision at the moment. I also want to emphasize that at the moment, the Oratrice's verdict for his case is allegedly within the context of the missing persons disappearances cases, and not within the other potential atrocities he could have committed as a harbinger. We don't have any direct confirmation if the Oratrice considers potential records of crime and magnitude of destruction. On a smaller scale, but a good enough comparison, we know that conversely, Lyonnais' judgment was based solely within the context of the missing persons cases, but there is a lingering active case of potential trespassing and intended tampering with the Oratrice. Maybe even conspiracy if we really stretch it out, considering he's working with Arlecchino at the moment regarding a nation-ending prophecy. But Lyonnais was judged by the Oratrice as innocent despite admission of the crime. So the question is, why is Tartaglia convicted as guilty, and what is he guilty of? Regardless, at the current state of the lore, Tartaglia is being held in the Fortress of Meropide, which is an underwater prison where the convicted are brought to serve out their sentences. So we have the core concepts of the Oratrice, Tartaglia's sentence, the prophecy, and Arlecchino. So with that in mind, I have my own questions that I want to introduce in this video. I'm interested in the deeper logistics of Tartaglia's arrest and the potential repercussions of his trial, instead of simply just asking if he is guilty or otherwise. Hopefully, by introducing these questions, I can explore the actual logistics of the potential plan behind the arrest and the hidden nuances of whatever scheme he's a pawn of. So number one is, what is the Oratrice's criteria for judgment in the first place? This is just a general question of how involved really is the Oratrice when it comes to the dealing with the prophecy, and what's its complete criterion and role in adjudicating the final verdict. We are told that it has sentience of some sort, and that it balances all the potential outputs given during the court trial to reach a verdict. But does it also have access to more divine information, such as premonitions of the people involved's backgrounds? For example, when Lyonnais was accused of being part of the Fatui, it weighed the scales against his favor. But does that mean if the information was never really used as evidence against him, the Oratrice would not have considered it as a condemning factor for his verdict? That's what I'm considering. The true criteria of judgment, quote-unquote, is still definitely up in the air, because when people say that it bases off of the concept of justice and the people's belief in justice, that's as vague as it can get. What, is the people's collective consciousness regarding a concept that defines good and evil in the eyes of the Oratrice, or does it make its judgment based on objective morality? Or at least, what it thinks is objective. But then we move on to the deeper plans of the Fatui and the theory that this may be orchestrated. What would the probability of that even be? Along with the nuances of publicly painting a target on the Harbinger's back instead of working in the shadows like how they were doing for the other nations. So let's dissect this. Because the second question is it really necessary to even have the mediating factor of Tartaglia if the primary target is the Oratrice or the Gnosis? Think about it like this. We know that the most likely reason Tartaglia was accused was because of his connections to the confrere. But we can also operate under the deeper theory that Arlecchino orchestrated the trial for reasons currently unknown. Tartaglia's purpose for being in Fontaine was not yet disclosed to us, and Arlecchino would have the higher power and position to do such a thing, considering Tartaglia allegedly has no idea what's going on in this nation. But this theory stands on the question, is it really a good idea to put the spotlight on the Fatui and create a confirmation that they are somehow involved in grander plans? And why Tartaglia? Does it have to be a Fatui Harbinger, and are there repercussions to putting Harbinger front and center? Putting Tartaglia on the spot where not only the citizens, but also the Chief Justice and the Hydro Archon are forced to further scrutinize his innocence would mean that the Fatui in general would have a large target on their backs. Alongside this would be heightened security and paranoia amongst the people. But conversely, this would create the perfect opportunity to get Tartaglia in an interesting position physically, the Fortress of Meropide. Tartaglia is a unit in and of himself, even without his vision. Restraining him normally is already a difficult task, even with the presence of another vision wielder. Or maybe it's not a direct confrontation. Tartaglia would be privy to being exposed to the deeper facilities of the fortress. We don't know how crafty he is, or if there's a need for him to stay in the facility as per Arlecchino's plans, but I've always found the idea of sealing a powerful person in a prison with other morally questionable strong people to be a recipe for disaster. Or maybe the purpose isn't for Tartaglia, but instead for the people. When the Oratrice operates on the concept of justice, the primary target for alteration is the people's perceptions. And we see in the Archon Quest that tensions immediately rose when there became a discrepancy between the Oratrice and the Chief Justice. People immediately questioned if the trials were legitimate, or if the concept of justice is a concrete enough criteria to have judicial merit. While Tartaglia is a Fatui, the people seeing a clearly innocent man convicted would test their preconceived notions, thus potentially influencing the Oratrice's definition of justice even further. So with that in mind, let me present to you the following possibilities. Number 1. Tartaglia is guilty by association with the Fatui. First possibility is that Tartaglia really is guilty, not because of directly causing the serial disappearances cases, but rather because of association with the Fatui. Is it possible that Vacher's research had more behind-the-scenes work assistance than we first thought? And of course, I'm not saying that Vacher is a Fatuus just because he's Snezhnayan, but rather that he got help gathering the materials, or perhaps maybe Tartaglia actually did something that we as an audience just aren't aware of. After all, while he can seem innocent now, we can't completely rule out the possibility that he actually did something suspicious regarding not necessarily the disappearances, but the things around it, the primordial seawater, or even the prophecy. Who knows, honestly. Number 2 is that Tartaglia is objectively innocent but is an unwilling instrument or accomplice of Arlecchino. This possibility connects to the theory that Arlecchino is the true mastermind behind Tartaglia's trial, and why she needs Tartaglia is currently unknown. Number 3 is that Tartaglia's fight for freedom is an orchestrated event that he is aware of, thus being guilty of conspiring against Fontaine. Ultimately, it also doesn't matter if Tartaglia is actually aware or not, but it's possible that Tartaglia's incorrect verdict is meant to be an orchestrated event that instills revolution. And following that, because Tartaglia was seen by the Oratrice as a potentially involved asset in a bigger scheme that may or may not be indirectly connected to the serial disappearances cases, an example, the whole involvement of primordial water being tied to the Fatui's involvement with prophecy, maybe that's why the Oratrice sees Tartaglia as a potential danger. Number 4 is that the Oratrice has been tampered with prematurely by either Linny or someone else entirely. Another possibility is that the Oratrice was compromised. I doubt that Linny would really be able to do damage in the span of a minute, so I also doubt that the Oratrice was completely tampered with. But considering the time gap between the serial disappearances case trial and Linny's preliminary targeting of the Oratrice, the Fatui could have made their move between the downtime. But what's even more difficult to pinpoint is how it was tampered with. The Oratrice has a voice and an alleged internal consciousness, at least according to Linny. We don't even know for certain what the Oratrice is and how it operates, but fundamentally, a contraption that allegedly takes the abstract and quantifies it can be tampered with, simply by changing the criterion of what it defines as guilty or not guilty. Number 5 is that the Oratrice's verdict is meant to be a premonition rather than an actual verdict. We don't completely know what constitutes the Oratrice's verdict, and while it's supposed to deliver judgment, there's also a possibility that it foresaw the future actions of Tartaglia instead of the past, though this possibility isn't set in stone. Number 6 is that Tartaglia's verdict is connected to his backstory instead of the Fatui or Arlecchino. This one was a possibility that I considered when I went back on the dialogue of the Archon Quest, and it's the possibility that Tartaglia's involvement with the Abyss and the Narwhal in his past may have been misconstrued by the Oratrice as being indirectly connected to the water of the Primordial Sea. Considering that what is primordial in Genshin is also seen as beyond the jurisdiction of the Seven. Whether this constitutes directly his foul legacy or maybe his other Hydro-based abilities, we will never know. We also still don't understand where his vision came from, which is a rarity for the Lord to not have at least one vision story. Tartaglia is also aware of heretical teachings from the Abyss, but the true question is, Would the Oratrice really take that into account considering the context of the case that he's involved in? We also don't know if the Oratrice is even omnipotent enough for that kind of thing. But with everything said and done, we have a list of Arlecchino's core motivations moving forward. We also know that the primary motivations of the Fatui are the following: investigate the Oratrice, find out more about the prophecy, and to use the power of the Gnosis. I also want to summarize my answers to the question of, is it beneficial for the Fatui to use Tartaglia as a scapegoat? My answer for this one is yes. While it is a risk to put the spotlight on the Fatui, that's only if the serial disappearances cases were never solved. However, there was a clear admission of murder on the part of Vacher, so the Fatui should have been in the clear. Tartaglia, by the perception of the people, is innocent. So having Tartaglia as a scapegoat would mean that unrest would permeate through Fontaine. 1, because if Tartaglia was truly innocent, the people would lose trust in the Oratrice. 2, because this would involve the Traveler as a potential accomplice considering they have Tartaglia's vision. 3 is that the people would also lose trust in the Hydro Archon and force Furina to consider the security of her nation against the prophecy. 4 is that this would remove suspicion from another Fatui Harbinger being the possible perpetrator, because the people would solely focus on Tartaglia, or the guards would never expect for another Harbinger to enter the fray. And 5th is that Tartaglia would have a unique incentive to fight against the laws of Fontaine and instigate chaos in the Fortress of Meropide. If there's one thing that Tartaglia doesn't do, it's back down. And I can definitely see him itching to pick a fight to prove his innocence and his strength within the confines of the prison. But that's it for me today. What does this mean for the future patches? There's a possibility that Arlecchino is being painted as the quote-unquote good guy of Act 3, and not in the way that you expect. While we know from the trailer that she's definitely up to something, the current plot makes it seem like the Fatui are the underdogs of this story, because they have been seemingly framed on 2 separate occasions. One with Linny actually being framed and Tartaglia seemingly innocently being condemned. So the possibility of Arlecchino playing the role of a false comrade isn't too far-fetched. We have also been given a reason by Linny not to actively antagonize the Fatui as of yet, as he says that Arlecchino's motivations are for the supposed well-being of Fontaine, but the legitimacy of those claims are, again, to be scrutinized in the future Archon Quest. I don't believe for a second that Arlecchino isn't being misleading towards the 3 siblings, or that her reasons for what she does are completely altruistic. After all, there is a truth hidden behind all these smokes and mirrors. The important event that we'll have to deal with in the future patches is going to the Fortress of Meropide and getting to the bottom of all of this. We know in the next patch we're going to meet the administrator of the fortress himself, so I'm curious how this will all go down. I definitely think that this is going to be a prison break, or at least working with the Chief Justice to see the history of the Oratrice and what justice truly means. But that's it for me today, a more speculative video to open September with. What do you think is with Tartaglia's verdict? Do you think he is guilty? Do you think he's being framed? Or is he really just innocent? Anyway, my name is Aster and thank you for chilling with me. Happy September! So with that in mind, let me present to you the following possibilities. Number 1. My voice cracked. Jesus.